Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, here in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to open this conversation today at a critical time for understanding Russian foreign policy and the broader relationship between Russia, its so-called near abroad, and the West. With a new US administration now inaugurated in Washington, D.C., there are renewed debates about how the United States and its allies should approach Russia. Sitting in Moscow, there's certainly been an understanding from Kremlin leadership that a chaos strategy of hybrid war tactics has been incredibly effective at balancing out Russia's power asymmetries against the Western alliance and the United States in particular. It's my pleasure to be able to launch today an important report that makes a critical intervention in this debate, The Evolution of Hybrid War. It's a report that has come together with many contributions from across Europe, and we'll get into the discussion with my colleague and friend, Mathieu Boulège, who is a research fellow at the Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia program. It's a report that looks at how Russian hybrid war has evolved in the many countries where Russia is now playing an influential and a malign role in trying to shape on-the-ground dynamics and public policy. This report would not have been possible without the support of the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and for that, we at CEPA are grateful. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Mathieu, to take us into the discussion with our distinguished authors who help contribute to the analytical breadth and depth of this project. Mathieu.
Thank you very much, Alina, for those words. And as you mentioned, we use the concept of chaos to understand Russia's strategy. Basically, the aim of generating increased entropy and destabilization to achieve the intended effects. In this context, hybrid or full spectrum warfare, as it is understood as a tactical application of this chaos strategy. Full spectrum warfare deploys a blend of conventional and non-conventional means aimed at affecting targets while seeking to avoid direct military confrontation with Western states. Such efforts generally include irregular warfare, active measures, special operations that have already been very well documented so far. The Kremlin's use of hybrid warfare or full spectrum warfare is basically understood as a means to compensate for its weaknesses vis-à-vis the United States and NATO. But hybrid warfare is not static, and over time, Russian views on the conduct and efficacy of its chaos strategy has evolved based on experience, based on the development of new tools and assessment of the Western response. And from Western point of view, it is paramount to assess this evolution of Russia's hybrid warfare tactics to better understand likely future developments in multi-vector warfare against our interests and also against international institutions and frontline states. And this is what we hope to achieve with this report, to basically assess, understand, and respond to the evolution of Russia's view of the chaos strategy through critical example of Russia's use of hybrid warfare and non-linear tactics. To do so, we have worked around 4 excellent case studies published by 5 amazing colleagues throughout Europe. On Ukraine, we've had the chance to have Kateryna Zarembo and Sergiy Solodkyy from the New Europe Center in Kiev in Ukraine. For Estonia, Kalev Stoicescu worked on explaining hybrid warfare from the Estonian and Baltic point of view, and Kalev is a research fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security, the ICDS in Estonia. For the UK, we have an example sent out by Professor Chatterje-Doody, a lecturer in politics and international studies at the Open Society in the UK. And finally, last but not least, Oscar Jonsson, academic director at the Center for the Governance of Change at IE University in Spain, is presenting a case study on the European Union and NATO as institutions impacted by Russia's hybrid warfare. Each case study examines the evolution of Russia's tailored toolkit of nonlinear means of action, the impact on respective countries and institutions, as well as policy responses to this challenge. What we want to do today is sort of have an engaging discussion to present the key finding of this paper, but also to have a wider discussion on the issue at hand. The first question I will ask my co-panelists is basically, how do you assess the evolution of Russia's hybrid warfare in your country or institution? Let's jump right to Ukraine.
Thank you, Matthew, for presentation. So answering your question, I would like to stress to underline that in contradiction to majority of analytical documents analyzing hybrid warfare in Ukraine, provided by Russia, carried out by Russia, we studied our analysis from so-called preparatory stage. So when majority of analysts try to understand, to analyze Russian steps, Russian efforts, destructive efforts after occupation of Crimea, after military actions in the east of Ukraine in 2014. We studied our analysis, in fact, from the first days when Soviet Union collapsed. So we analyzed lots of different political, economic, information activities towards Ukraine. So, and major aggressive events we exampled in the documents were such as Yuri Mishkov, secessionist activities in early 90s in Crimea. Also, we analyzed Tuzla operation carried out by Russia in 2003. And we regarded all of those events as preparation to more destructive, to more ruining activities which we witnessed in the last 7 years, and we entitled them as hybrid warfare, labeled them in this way. So after preparatory stage, we calculated and counted 3 major phases, 3 major stages. First one we called as a failed blitzkrieg, when Russia used military, when Russia used its troops, of course, not acknowledging, not recognizing this, but we do know that Russia planned to occupy not only Crimea or part of eastern territories of Ukraine, but greater parts of Ukraine in the south and east of Ukraine, which were called by Russian propaganda machine as so-called New Russia, not Nova Russia. But these plans were failed, in fact, because of great resistance from the side of Ukrainian government or Ukrainian society, and that is why Russia had to minimize or to limit its destructive hybrid actions. And then we analyze the next stage, second stage of hybrid warfare, which was launched after so-called Minsk II agreements. And after this event, after this agreement, Russia launched or slowed down military activities and focused primarily on political, economic, and propagandist activities, trying to discredit Ukrainian authorities, both in Ukraine and abroad, so Ukraine could lose its partners, allies in the West, and in this way, somehow Russia tried to soften or lift sanction or this tough politics towards itself. And then we analyze the last phase, which we are still witnessing. Approximately, we decided to analyze or to calculate it since the last presidential election in Ukraine in spring 2019, when Volodymyr Zelensky became a president of Ukraine, and when Russia had great expectations to see concessions from Ukraine's side. Currently, all of us understand, and of course Russia understands, that these plans were not grounded, and new president did not make these concessions. But anyway, this stage was characterized by huge political influence through its agents, political agents, actors inside of Ukraine, through propaganda information tools. And that does not exclude that Russia will mix up and interchange and will use other tools in the nearest time, as soon as it understands that its first plans and ideas were not implemented. And I personally cannot exclude that Russia may use, for example, military tools now more intensively, like it was in 2014.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's maybe jump directly to Estonia, because although Estonia hasn't been officially invaded yet by Russian forces, you have experienced in Estonia a lot of cyber activities. And Kalev, could you tell us more about the way you understand hybrid warfare against your country?
Well, thank you, Matthew, for engaging me in this project. And speaking about Estonia not having been invaded yet by Russian forces, I hope it will never occur. But speaking about Russia's hybrid war or warfare, like in the Ukrainian case, it's not something new. It's something that has been going on for almost 30 years, from the time Estonia reestablished its independence, as I brought some examples in the chapter. When Estonia clearly chose a Western political orientation and demanded the withdrawal of former Soviet or Russian troops from its territory. They cut off the gas in 92, now or was it 93, and they immediately realized that it doesn't work because the Russian speakers in northeastern Estonia were the first to be hit by it. Then this hybrid warfare was oriented towards derailing, so to say, Estonia's efforts to join the European Union and NATO, using, for instance, the border issue for that. And we don't have a border treaty with Russia still in force. So that didn't work either. After we became members of both EU and NATO in 2004, we had the cyber attacks of 2007. And that wasn't a coincidence either, because that was shortly after President Putin delivered his infamous speech in Munich in February of 2007 at the Wehrkunde conference that shocked the Western world. It was a chilly wind, a Cold War wind coming low, and then we saw that Russia aggressed Georgia. In 6 years, it aggressed Ukraine and so forth. So we see that this Russia's hybrid warfare evolves in time. It is customized or tailored according to the targeted audiences, the specific countries or regions that they keep in mind. So, and Estonia is of course specific also in this context. It is a small country, a neighboring country of Russia. It has a Russian-speaking minority, and it used to be under Moscow's control until about 30 years ago. So for us, this seems like a long, long time ago. But for them, or for the Kremlin, in many ways, it's like yesterday, because they are, unlike us, very much stuck mentally in the past. As concerns the present and the near future, I don't think Estonia is a primary target or priority for Russia in terms of waging high intensity, so to say, hybrid warfare, but rather a choice of opportunity if that arises. So that could be caused by a direct conflict between Russia and the United States or NATO in some other area. And it would be perhaps a good opportunity for them to pay back here, attack a small ally of NATO and EU. So Estonia is part of the West, and therefore we would always have to reckon with the Russian hybrid attacks, with this possibility, as long as Russian-Western relations are strained or confrontational as they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalev. And talking about the West, if we move further afield from Russia and Russia's border, then the UK is also a very interesting example of Russian hybrid tactics and hybrid warfare. against a leading country in formerly the European Union, but at least in Europe, with the UK. And we've seen a major uptick in non-linear activities in the UK, especially after the Skripal assassination attempt in 2018. Precious, can you give us your view concerning how the UK has been addressing this issue of hybrid warfare, and what have been the main activities?
Yeah, certainly. So I think in the UK context that the idea of hybridity rather than warfare is the thing that's most significant, because obviously in the UK there's not really any sort of prospect of psychological operations being backed up with military operations. And one thing that's really key, I think, in the UK context is really just how much of a scattergun approach we've seen really in Russian influence type operations. So there's a real mix of sort of genuine top-down coordinated strategic operations in specific areas, and in particular in cyber activity, for example, but also coupled with very pragmatic use of potential openings as they occur. And that's something that we've seen a real evolution in terms of this, pragmatic acceptance and adoption of opportunities as they occur for influence in the UK. And this is involved increasing levels of delegation to some extent, and increasing willingness from the Russian side to cede control of those activities and to accept incidental benefits from maybe independent actors' activities, or to kind of sort of piggyback off other trends, essentially, or other institutional weaknesses in the UK. And essentially, I guess the overall aim is to create a general atmosphere conducive to improving Russia's influence in the UK, whether that's in general terms, in terms of sort of promoting the destabilization of particular norms and values and institutional trust, or whether, you mentioned the Skripal poisoning, whether that's in terms of promoting a very specific Russian foreign policy line on events such as those. And that's one of the kind of key things that we've seen happening more and more in the UK over time, is this basically attempt to create real strong narrative support for particular Russian foreign policy priorities, especially when they're very controversial in the international arena. And I think we'll probably talk about this more later on, but certainly that's one of the ways we've seen an evolution in Russia's attempts, is the ability to kind of capitalize on real controversial issues like that, and the mistrust and the lack of information around them, and to basically use various different types of entry point, whether those are official, top-down, coordinated ones, or opportunistic use of other actors' interventions to really bolster a Russian foreign policy line, I would say.
Thank you very much, Precious. And it's important also to remind that Russian activities are not just bilateral, right? It's not just one country against another one. It also affects international institutions such as the EU and NATO. And I will leave the floor to you, Oscar, to give us your feeling about how these operations are conducted, specifically against multilateral organizations like the European Union and the Atlantic Alliance.
Thank you very much for that, Mathieu. And I'm very happy to be here today. And I think the first thing we need to actually understand when it comes to targeting the EU and NATO is that there's a lot of intelligence gathering, there's a lot of disinformation targeting the EU and NATO, but by themselves, the institutions are not the most interesting thing. I mean, the institutions are the embodiment of political will, the unified West. And they will be spied and they will be disrupted. But the key thing is that it is the unity of the member states that are holding up this together, these organizations together. So the big prize is actually targeting them very, very differently. I mean, the approach is tailor-made for each country. In Germany, for instance, the German business circles are very pro-Kremlin. For instance, the new CDU frontrunner Laschet, for instance, warned against demonizing Putin after they used chemical weapons in a NATO territory, which is the UK, and the Skripal poisoning. And I think this is a good example that a lot of the Russian approach to EU and NATO is about division. It's about destruction. it's not about attraction. For instance, we see China, who are using a lot of economic measures to gain political influence, but rather it's about destroying unity and destroying processes within these countries. And this is something that hybrid warfare, if you want to call it that, is actually very, very good at. And there's a lot of opportunities across and within the EU and NATO to amplify these divisions.
Thank you very much on that. Let's go in reverse order, and I'll leave the floor again to you, Oscar, because what I want to discuss now is the impact of these evolving tactics and this evolution of Russian hybrid warfare. Calculating impact of such operations, specifically in the information realm, is often sort of a goose chase for information or disinformation warriors, because it is really hard to make out exactly how much impact do you have, but what is it really changing in terms of public perceptions or public attitudes or even voting, all these operations, and how do we measure them? In a way, Precious touched upon it by mentioning the creation or promotion of an atmosphere conducive to Russian interests. Oscar, how do you see the evolution of these tactics in terms of impacts? Do you feel that there are some things changing on the ground in terms of policies, in terms of increased disunity, for instance, across the European Union and NATO?
No, and I think that is the key question. I mean, what does this operation really do? And I think the good news in this is that, you know, a lie published by RT is not going to change the attitude and the atmosphere of an entire country or an entire set of groups of countries in an international organization. Actually, this is something that, you know, every single politician and every single lobby group is trying to figure out. How do you change opinions and attitudes of actually people? So it's easy to take these influence operations and blow them out of proportion, because we see the activity and we often equal that to impact. But the bad news is that all of these hybrid and influence, especially disinformation options, are the most effective when they're touching upon genuine grievances and genuine polarization. And boy, here's the bad news, is that there's a lot of political crises in EU and NATO countries, and especially in these countries, we're seeing a decrease in the belief in democracy, we're seeing a decrease in belief in media, we see hollowing out of the middle of the political spectrum. And I mean, we had the runoff between Macron and Le Pen, you know, obviously having finance from Kremlin. So if we see it in this wider context, with basically declining belief in the political legitimacy of the other side, and I mean, for some examples, for very good measures, we see a good opportunity to impact. And this is not to say that, you know, Russian hybrid operations is going to reshape Europe, but they can tip the scales. You know, I saw yesterday a poll actually on France with saying 52% for Macron and 48% for Le Pen. And if you know, an effective operation can tilt 2%, that could be completely enough to tilt an entire country. Let me just give you one specific example, which I think is very good in terms of what Precious said in terms of atmosphere. And that is, when Montenegro acceded to NATO, President Trump called it a very aggressive country. And the question is, where does this views come from? Because I can tell you, it does not come from US intelligence circles saying, hey, Montenegro is aggressive. There's literally no one else who've given that narrative except the Russian leadership and Russian news outlets. And this is not to say that, hey, they're providing speaking points for Trump, but that is to say, in one way or another, Trump's information circles are susceptible to narratives coming from the Russian leadership. I'd be happy to hear someone else say it, but and this is, I think, you know, you seldom see very, very direct instances of information influence, but this is a very good examples how it actually can have a way. And I mean, this is particularly the former president of the US, but it's also for other countries as well. It's about creating and impacting an atmosphere that sometimes has very, very concrete effects.
Thank you, Oscar. Let's get back to the UK with Precious. The impact has been quite important, not least because I've been living there since the uptick in hybrid warfare from Russia, but also because we've seen the policy debate somewhat change concerning these operations.
Yeah, it's another one where a lot of what Oscar said actually really applies to the UK case. So it's very, very difficult to establish what kind of impact Russian influence operations have often. partly because for many of the activities relevant in the UK context, there isn't necessarily a clear causal chain between, you know, we can see what's being attempted, we can't necessarily see or measure the extent to which it is effective. But also because even if we have evidence that an attempt has been made, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was effective. So an example of this is that the UK government concluded that Russia-linked actors had almost certainly attempted to influence the 2019 general election, but whether or not that had any impact at all, we still can't really say, and there's an ongoing criminal investigation into that to try and work it out. And this kind of makes responses difficult because there's a tendency to you know, catastrophize about what attempts are being made, and sometimes that can really, I think, stymie more effective policy responses, when actually caution, I think, could be quite useful. So, for example, we think about, you know, in the UK case, very much increased infiltration of various social, political, and economic networks. That's been identified by successive parliamentary reports, and often it's by actors with unclear links to the Russian state, so maybe private individuals who have some sort of links to Russian state enterprises. Now, that's not to say that this is Russian state directed action, because there's no evidence of that. But the fact of the matter is that if there is a vulnerability there, the vulnerability itself is the issue, right? So actually having gaps in a system, vulnerabilities in the system, that's certainly, I think, for the UK case, a massive priority in terms of fixing those gaps, so that whether or not we can see if certain activities have an impact, we have to close down the avenues through which they could have an impact, essentially. And I think that's really one of the kind of most pressing things we need to do, rather than necessarily worrying about, are we ever going to prove a certain causal chain? It's more about taking that pragmatic sort of risk-focused response in terms of, well, how can we ensure that it wouldn't happen anyway?
Thank you, Precious, for this. Let's jump back to Estonia. Kalev, you mentioned the presence of Russian-speaking minorities, for instance, and we know they've been targeted specifically by Russian disinformation propaganda. How do you gauge the impact of these activities on your country?
Yes, thank you. It's a good question. I will respond to it, but first I want to give a more general assessment. Speaking about the impact, one has to keep in mind what's Russia's aim. In the case of Estonia, is to weaken and to discredit our country, to show that it's not worth to be even independent, to be part of the West. It's not worth to be defended by the allies. However, I mean, Estonia is not a weak state that Russia can relatively easily destabilize or manipulate. It's governed by the rule of law. The level of corruption and criminality are rather low, and we don't have any relevant political parties or movement or politicians who would be pro-Russian. In this sense, I don't see a serious impact on the country as a whole. What we sense is that Russia plays, in the sense, against Estonia, against the West in general, a long-term game on a long-term impact, a kind of an erosion, little by little, of public trust and support of democracy. We see that Western countries basically don't have any kind of illusions about Russia and what are Russia's aims actually, and vis-a-vis the West, even if there are, as it was said, certain business interests. The most tangible impact on of the Russian hybrid warfare, speaking of the Russian-speaking minority, is in terms of Russian propaganda and disinformation that reaches them mainly through the state-run TV channels of Russia and some online news like RT, Sputnik News, the PBK, the First Baltic Channel, Первый Балтийский Канал, and so on. And they watch these because obviously Russian speakers prefer to watch TV programs in their own language. I will come back later, probably when you ask the next question, of what we have tried to do in terms of offering them media in Russian language, but kind of in a Western Estonian style that is free of propaganda and disinformation, so to say. And Then what else? I mean, we have learned from the cyber attacks of 2007, if we speak of impacts, and that certainly raised not only our awareness of cyber threats and vulnerabilities and the necessity to strengthen cybersecurity and defense, but strengthen the awareness of our allies as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalev. Let's go back to Ukraine. Kateryna, the impact is tremendously more important, as we can imagine, on Ukraine, and the cost of human life and economic destruction and societal division in Ukraine has been tremendous since 2014. And this is, you know, if you're looking for impact, there you go. You have a definite cost in a way. Can you tell us more about how you feel and gauge the impact of Russian operations in your country?
Yes, absolutely. You already named some very concrete and measurable instances of impact of the Russian aggression. So Ukraine is currently not controlling a big part of its territory. The human cost is over 13,000 casualties, as you know. Its GDP has not recovered to the level of 2013. So this is something that we can document and pinpoint in, let's say, hard numbers and human lives indeed. On a more subtle level, I would say that we actually observe a fluctuation, and here is also where this evolution, the concept of evolution also works well. On the one hand, Russia actually shot itself in the foot with the public opinion, and we write about it in the report that if it could count on 30, more or less 30% of supporters of any integration with Russia in Ukraine after aggression in 2014, this number dropped tremendously. And it reached its lowest in 2017-2018, when those who would actually state in a poll that they support any kind of union or communion with Russia community would be around 7 to 10%. But what we see now, and I think this is one of the rather immediate impacts, again, we have this so to say, culture of secrecy, when people would not openly state their mind, even if they support Russia. So we can imagine that this number of supporters could be maybe a little bit higher. But what we also see is the comeback of the pro-Russian forces. So, for example, in 2019, at the parliamentary elections, the faction of the opposition platform for Life, which is the key pro-Russia party in Ukraine, showcased very decent result with several dozens of deputies in the Rada currently. In the local elections, they also manifested very strong hold on the region in the east, in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. The local elections took place very recently in October 2020. So we see that there is a reasonable share of population who votes for this party, who vote for this party, who support certain pro-Russian platforms. I'm saying this because there are other also local parties, but they all come under the same umbrella. So we can see this kind of tacit revanche, which is definitely of pro-Russian forces, which is definitely not yet strong enough to be popular in the whole of the country, but definitely gains more ground than back in 2014-15 when the front line was moving. Another point which we see all over through this hybrid phase starting from 2014 and probably before too, but now it's more acute, is this distrust toward the central government and the central authorities, be that the current president or the former president or whichever cabinet, which is being fueled by Russia or pro-Russian forces. The examples are the leaked conversation between previous President Petro Poroshenko and Vladimir Putin about Poroshenko's chocolate factory in Russia and his assets and ownership there and what it involves, you know, for his reputation in Ukraine. Another example is a recent, very loud case with the constitutional crisis in Ukraine, which not only threw into chaos the constitutional court, and the issue is still not resolved in Ukraine, but it was also the cancellation of one of the key anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine with the submission of the declaration. So this reform was one of the showcase reforms of the 2014-15, so the early days, the early years after the start of the aggression. So I would say that these 2 points, so the revenge of pro-Russian forces and the continuous fuel distrust of the authorities, whichever authorities we'll talk about, previous or former ones, are the immediate impact, which is hard to pinpoint, to trace it directly to Russia at all cases, at all instances, but which is there and definitely caters to Russia's interest in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Kateryna. Let's jump right to this phase of adaptation and resilience, which is how we grow from these crises and how we grow from Russian information operations and hybrid operations. How has your country in Ukraine, Kateryna, adapted to this impact of the war and to this impact of continued destabilization attempts? What are the lessons learned from your country? And in a way, what can we learn from Ukraine's experience? What has worked? What has not worked as well in terms of building resilience and in terms of strengthening societies in Ukraine?
Right. I will start out here. Maybe my colleague Sergiy will also jump in. In the first place, I would say there are some very specific and concrete steps which can be enumerated here. Again, they fall rather to 2014-15 in the most acute phase of the aggression, the phase which we call failed blitzkrieg. So it was the resilience of the army, the rebuilding of the army from scratch. This is a well-known case. Construction of a brand new security strategy, which would manifest itself both in the documents, strategic military and security documents in Ukraine, and also actually rebuilding a strategy in the conditions of the aggression. And the third pillar would be the reforms, which would encompass the wider context, which would go beyond military and security, but this is about state building and institutions. So you need resilient institutions, you need the rule of law, you need the working courts, the police, and the economy to sustain basically the implementation of the reforms at the front line and at all other branches. Some of the, I think, loudest Ukraine's reforms actually also fall on this period, which shows that you can at the same time do the state building and counter the aggressor in a very literate, physical way, meaning of this word. I have to say that it would not be possible also without two components, and literally I wouldn't like maybe even to imagine what it would have been like without these two. One is civil society support, well, in terms of military and security, civil society, or as it's also called uncivil society, in 2014 literally put the mission on its shoulders and both went to frontline and sustained the frontline as volunteers with materials and personnel and whatever you need at the frontline. The other pillar, the other component is the international support. We can say that despite all the discussions and criticism of whether the West could do more, whether the West could do differently in its support to Ukraine, there has been this tip on the scale in Ukraine's favor, both on the side of the EU and the US. And we believe that these were very crucial components in Ukraine's resilience. Sergiy, would you like to take from here?
Yes, Kateryna, first of all, I fully support what you've just said, but I can only add that Ukrainians have shown that they can learn quickly. And perhaps this feature, quickness, is the best friend, ally of effective counter hybrid warfare. Adding to this, quickness and solidarity and unity. Because Ukrainians, when they understood that you cannot just accept further occupation efforts of Russia in Crimea, in east, south of Ukraine, you need to react and as quick as possible. That is why the central government in Ukraine decided to send troops to resist Russian destructive, aggressive activities. And it was done quite quickly with support of civil society, of volunteers. And that is why Russia had to change its military activities very quickly as well. And the scope was limited in that way. Solidarity and unity, of course, Russia miscalculated that the West would so quickly support Ukraine. Would so quickly and in a large scale impose sanctions against Russia, because we all remember February or March 2014 and Russian discourse about the West, which is too weak and which has no consensus with regards to punishing Russia because of any activities towards neighbors. And all of us remember war against Georgia in 2008, when Western reaction was limited only by strong statements, but no punishment, no sanctions towards Russia. And that was another miscalculation of Russia, but effective example of countering Russian hybrid affairs. That is why quickness and solidarity are major allies of effective countering hybrid warfare.
Swiftness and solidarity is exactly what we've seen, I would argue, in Estonia after the cyber attacks. And today, Estonia is one of the leading countries in cyber defense and cybersecurity. Kalev, what is your take on what your country has learned in terms of rebuilding?
Well, thank you. In many ways, we should be quote unquote thankful to Russia for, in this sense, they have helped us a little bit or encouraged us to go on this path. Speaking of Estonia's adaptation in this context of Russian hybrid warfare, it is about lessons identified first of all and learned from the events of April-May 2007 that you mentioned, as well as other instances. So Estonia has established thereafter new institutions and structures like the State Information System Authority, that is tasked with overall governmental coordination in developing cyber defense and responding to cyber attacks and incidents at 24 hours a day. So the private sector is also very closely engaged. Telecoms, commercial banks, media and transportation companies, etc., etc. So this is about protecting all vital sectors of the country in case of a serious crisis and not just online services and communication. So there is a League of Defense in Estonia made up of volunteers and part of Estonia's defense forces. So this League of Defense has established a cyber unit as well that I explained in the paper. So these are professional people who help as well in strengthening our cyber defense and security. Then there is, I brought another example, the Propaganda Stop. Once again, volunteers who fight against propaganda and disinformation attacks and try to educate readers and try to distinguish bringing out facts from different sources, what is true, what is false, etc., etc. So yes, I believe it works, but the real proof would be, of course, a successful response to attacks, including in cyber domains. But also perhaps the mere fact that we're not attacked now is perhaps also a proof that we're doing well. So we should continue to do what we have started in the future. What concerns Russia's official TV channels, that's continue to spread propaganda and disinformation, especially among Russian speakers. That would depend on how Russia would behave in the future and how aggressive it would be or not. So we have chosen not to banish those or to ban those channels so far. And my last point is that we have to learn daily from the experience of others, of our allies. Russia hasn't attacked lately our, let's say, parliaments or government servers or their web pages, but they have attacked those of the United States, of Germany, of the UK and other countries lately. So we cooperate with our allies and we try to help each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalev. Let's jump back to the UK. Precious, we've seen the publication, for instance, of the Russia report that made a lot of buzz in the UK over the summer. But the response to Russian aggression has also been a very contentious and divisive issue in the UK body politic. Can you tell us more about how you perceive what we've learned?
So we've definitely seen a kind of a strategic evolution in the UK in terms of how this so-called Russia threat is perceived. So if 10, 11 years ago in the UK's national security strategy, there was no individual state threat identified, then when that was updated in 2015, you know, Russia was very overtly identified in there as being a threat that had become more aggressive, authoritarian and nationalist. And at that time, increased cooperation was identified as a means to address this. And I think in some areas, we've seen quite an effective take-up of that kind of strategy. So, for example, you know, building on, say, Estonian experience, we've had some quite substantial developments in terms of cybersecurity. So, for example, a real push towards improving UK cybersecurity capability, including through public-private partnerships, increasing defensive capabilities, deterrence of potential attacks, and various kind of technological developments, and really promoting international collaboration. But actually, despite that, we've seen a change in the character of informational aggression towards the UK, where it's less in terms of maybe attacks on critical national infrastructure and more to do with subtler sort of hack and leak operations, where the amplification stage of that hack and leak is the kind of most important part. So as I think Oscar mentioned earlier, you know, there are certain pre-existing social grievances that exist genuinely, and that's where this different type of informational manipulation comes in, is actually kind of making the most of or taking advantage of particular grievances that exist and then acting strategically to kind of bolster those. And in that area, I think in the UK, we've been somewhat less effective. Certainly there's been much more attempt very recently, you mentioned the Russia report in particular, to engage directly with some of these issues, and we have seen a raft of legislation across various areas attempting to address some of the key concerns. So in the financial arena, since 2018, there's been a massive bolstering of kind of financial measures, basically. So the introduction of a serious and organised crime unit to basically look at financial infiltration of London markets, for example, with dirty money, essentially the London laundromat, as it's called. We've had various, you know, sanctions and anti-money laundering acts put in place, unexplained wealth orders and asset freezes and that kind of thing to try and target infiltration of financial markets. On the informational side, there's been various things very recently, again, such as schemes to identify where particular political online content actually comes from, consideration of a type of FARA regulation, such as that in place in the US, and whether something like that could work here. We've had independent reviews of the journalism process, and this later on this year, we should also have a bill that looks at imposing on social media platforms a duty of care regarding their users. And also should clarify the relationship between social media platforms and news providers to try and get to the heart of the sort of disinformation and trust management issues in the UK. Now, obviously, because this builds on genuinely pre-existing negative trends, it's not solely a Russia problem. So actually dealing with those underlying issues, I think, is really crucial, certainly in the UK context. And this is particularly the case when we think about how politicised some of these areas are. So, for example, you know, we had the Brexit referendum, which was very socially divisive in the UK, and then subsequent suggestions that there was Russian interference within that. The question of whether or not even to investigate it has again become very politically divisive, and partly for understandable reasons, because obviously throwing something that contentious into further doubt is potentially quite deleterious to democratic legitimacy. But by not doing that, as has been pointed out through the Russia report and since, there's a real danger of not addressing those core problems and actually compounding that problem, allowing existing systemic vulnerabilities to continue, which does increase the potential for future interventions. So I think in that case, maybe the UK has not done so well. So in terms of building up future capacity, really, it's a case of building on international cooperation in key strategic areas. But beyond that, I think we need to really have a much greater level of strategic foresight, I think, in the UK in terms of the greyer areas of Russian influence operations. So, recognition that, it's not necessarily all very clear strategic top-down activities that we're dealing with, but rather that there's a lot of kind of opportunistic interventions building on systemic vulnerabilities. And if we don't have the political will to deal with those, then those opportunities for intervention are going to continue arising essentially, and we'll still be vulnerable to those.
Right, thank you, Precious. You mentioned political divisions, lack of political unity, and the need to strategically address core issues. This is something that is very much chiming, I think, when it comes to addressing these issues at the European level or at the level of the Atlantic Alliance. Do you see this issue as well, Oscar, when it comes to these institutions? And can we ever learn something about the nature and the scope of the Russia challenge?
Well, I think I'm an incurable optimist. I mean, I think we can learn. I think we can fail better. But I think it also underlines a bit of what's the problem right here. I think that, what has the EU NATO done? I mean, they have been drafting strategies, they've been building fusion cells, they're creating working groups, the kind of things that international organizations does. These are all good, but they are very reactive measures domain for domain. Take for instance, the EU is doing fact-checking EU versus disinfo, which is good because it shows the scope of digital disinformation. But who reads disinformation? Who reads debunking of disinformation? And let me give you a hint. It's not the people reading the Young News. Like the average education level of people reading fact-checking of fake news is through the roofs. So I think this underlines the deeper problem, which is that we need to strengthen resilience, but resilience is about absorbing shocks. So but you also need to stop the shocks from coming. So that has to do more with deterrence. Very simple metaphor. Think of a boxer. He works his abs, he works his footwork, which will make him better at missing shots and stopping shots. But he won't ever win a boxing match if he can't deliver any shots. So I think that our key work is actually about deterrence. And I think this is when it gets really tricky, because there's a lot of activity, but it hasn't really changed the Russian strategic calculus. What is this real cost for trying this opportunistic, long-term, low-cost, potentially high-value types of operation at as many fronts as you can, either by dirty money, by bribery, or by influence operation or subversion operation, etc. I think the key dynamic is still in place, that the Russian leadership is doing calculation that the potential reward for this is a lot higher than the cost. So I think this is about, in terms of learning, I think that, and I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk about, how do we clear the information domain, for instance. I think a part of the answer there is focus on the methods of inorganic amplification. So for instance, the problem is not that someone has a conspiracy theory that there are pedophiles in the US Capitol, because you always have conspiracy theories. The problem is that when these theories are inorganically amplified and given much more weight and shape how people see and understand the world, that's when it's a problem. So good news is actually you start seeing some of the things that I'm saying now coming to burgeoning realization. If you take the US Solarium Commission for what to do in cyberspace, there's a lot more focus there on being proactive and using kind of deterrence and punishment measures also in the UK to get there. But I think that, to answer the question is, resilience we need to do. And I think what the institutions have done so far, it's been quite focus on domain for domain, not changing, it's about stopping Russian operations, not Russian strategy, not changing the value that is coming from these operations. And that is something that I would like to see.
Thank you very much, Oscar. So it's a lifelong struggle. And one thing is clear, I think, from this discussion is that the current Russian leadership has no incentive to dial back its efforts to sow chaos against its neighbors and Western countries. So we should definitely expect more, not less, subversive activities emanating from the Kremlin for the foreseeable future. But without equal assessment and equal adaptation to Russia's evolving tactics of hybrid war, Western policies will become less effective over the long run, which is why the responses must be crafted to fit the specific national and institutional environments. But US leaders and policymakers can learn much more from the knowledge and experience of allies and partner states in Europe, countries and institutions which have been contending with the most aggressive and acute forms of Russian hybrid warfare. And I think this is what we've established to show in this new report and in the policy recommendations that go along with it. So thank you very much for your time, colleagues and friends. It was very good to have you today. I will stop it there for this conversation, and I look forward to the following discussions around this report. Thank you very much and stay safe.